Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our monthly Hazardous Webinar series, where we take a closer look at one of Natural Hazard Research Australia's research projects, its findings, and how it will be translated into practice. We're member of the project team and the people who use the research. My name is Dr Mary Cadeddu, and I'm one of the node research managers with the Centre, and I'm based in our Melbourne office. But before we commence, I'd like to acknowledge that we are all gathered from across a range of different Aboriginal lands today. I'm on Boonwurrung country, and I pay my respect to Boonwurrung elders, past, present, and emerging, as the traditional owners and custodians of these lands. These lands and waters across our country have always been places for teaching, research, and learning. I recognize the Boonwurrung people's continuing connection to land, waters, culture, and community, and that enduring contribution to knowledge and education. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. We have Matt Mason. Matt Mason is an associate professor in the UQ School of Civil Engineering. Matt's key areas of interest and expertise lie in the fields of wind engineering, stochastic modeling, and hazards, including convective storms and tropical cyclones, probabilistic modeling of structural vulnerability to wind, water, and hail, catastrophe loss modeling for natural hazards, severe weather observations, and wind tunnel testing and analysis. Matt Dyer is the executive manager of Hazard and Risk Unit at Queensland Fire Department, has more than 20 years experience of disaster management in Queensland, making significant contribution to disaster research, to policy and practice, and has guided disaster response through events that impacted regional Queensland communities, receiving the National Emergency Medal in recognition of his service and commitment to community safety. Today's webinar focuses on the modeling impact of natural hazards on interconnected infrastructure networks project. This research aims to develop vulnerability models that quantify how natural hazards impact public infrastructures, covering selected infrastructure and hazard types. The models are intended to support our understanding of long-term infrastructure risk, to enable estimation of post-disaster recovery times, and inform cost-benefit analysis for infrastructure resilient investment, addressing what's a current gap in publicly available tools of this kind. So I'll now hand it over Matt to share more about the research.
So thank you very much, Mary, for that introduction. As mentioned, we're going to be talking today about the project T2A7, which is modelling the impact of natural hazards on interconnected infrastructure networks. And this project has run for a couple of years now and has just reached its completion, which I think was a very good achievement. The project team that we had sort of changed a little bit over the life of the project, but ended up incorporating quite a number of researchers from here at the University of Queensland. On the project management committee, we also had representatives from the Queensland Fire Department and Queensland Reconstruction Authority, and Matt Dyer, who will talk today, is one of the reps from the Queensland Fire Department that's been involved in the project throughout. We did also have a few members from NHRA representing, so Mary, Blythe and Varna over the project, and I thank all of them for their contributions. In addition to these sort of official members of the project, we also had a number of service providers, and given the project is really focused on infrastructure networks, it was really important for us to have some of the infrastructure operators involved in the project. And these were, their level of involvement sort of ranged across different providers, but Powerlink, Energy Queensland, Queensland Urban Utilities, Transport and Main Roads in Queensland, City of Gold Coast and Optus all provided some input along the way on the project, and we're very grateful for their contributions. What is it that we were really wanting to do with the project? And really there were three key aims that we had. The first was really to understand the extent of both the direct and the cascading impacts on infrastructure that natural hazards have. And this was really because we have a good idea of how different types of buildings are impacted during natural hazards, but much less work has been done looking at how infrastructure itself is impacted. But this is really, really important for how people experience natural hazards. And so we think it's very, very important that we understand this a bit better. And to help us then use this information, what we wanted to do was really develop a series of damage estimation tools that could be used in modelling and different types of modelling to understand how that damage essentially impacted each of the networks. So we wanted to develop some of these damage estimation models and we'll talk. And the third thing is really we wanted to provide a framework to integrate these models into much broader risk assessment or case study type models so that we could really look at how infrastructure resilience and infrastructure investment could benefit from understanding the damage estimation. So we broke this down into really 4 primary tasks for the project. The first one really was to look at how we map out the networks. And as everyone would really understand, networks are complicated. So you just look outside your house, you can see sort of power lines generally going all over the place. And trying to incorporate that level of complexity into a model is quite tricky. So what we ended up doing here is really trying to simplify down the networks to just the components of those networks that were most vulnerable to natural hazards. And the way we went about trying to identify this was through the sort of standard literature approaches. But what we also did was ran some consultation meetings with the infrastructure operators to identify what were the most vulnerable assets on their networks and what they had experienced the most trouble with or the most damage on due to natural hazards. And they became the components of the network that we ended up modeling or putting into our simplified network models. And the project itself really looked at trying to understand how we do this for 3 types of networks and 3 types of hazards. And the 3 types of networks that we chose here was the road network, the electricity distribution network, and the potable water network. And we chose Southeast Queensland as our sort of test bed for developing the model and the modelling framework. But we think that the methodology itself is much more transferable and can go to anywhere in Australia that is needed, though there would be tweaks required, and particularly around the damage models that are used. But the framework we think is highly transferable. So the second main activity was really the development of the damage models. And what we determined was that we were going to look at developing 2 types of models. The first being direct damage models. And the way to think of this is the actual damage that occurs to a given asset when it's impacted by a natural hazard. And so, for example, this could be a distribution substation. When it receives a flood of a given level, what is the expected damage at that distribution substation? We then develop models for looking at the recovery time that is required. So what is very important for network functionality is not just the level of damage that occurs during an event, but how long it then takes for that particular asset to come back online so that the network itself can operate. So we had these 2 types of models, so the direct damage and the recovery time. Initially, we'd hoped we could also look at financial consequence models, but this proved to be much more complicated than we'd initially thought and sort of ended up being out of scope of what we were able to do within this project. Now, the methods we used to develop both the direct damage models and the recovery time models, again, initially we had hoped that these could be largely data-driven and we would be able to source either through publicly or with arrangements with the infrastructure operators, source the damage information about the level of damage that occurs down at the individual asset level. But this again proved to be really quite complicated to do and was only available for a small subset of the infrastructure that we were looking at. So what we ended up doing here was looking more broadly across literature, identifying what existed in other parts of the world and looking at which of those we could adopt in the Australian context. This was possible in some cases. In other cases, we did have some data available, which allowed us to empirically develop some of our damage functions. And others, we really had to rely on expert judgment, and that would be expert judgment of the infrastructure operators we were talking to, or we would initially come up with some types of damage model, then seek feedback from the end users on this. And so the damage models we have come up with throughout at the end of the project is a sort of a combination of these different types of approaches. So the third main task for the project was really to develop the functionality cascade model. So once we understood how individual assets would be affected by the natural hazards, we had to then say, well, how does damage at one particular asset impact the functionality of other components of the network? And to do this, we end up developing a hierarchical Bayesian model, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. But this allowed us to essentially connect both within a network, so one asset within, say, the power network to another asset in the power network, but then also allows us to connect the other networks. So the water network is not only reliant on the water network, it's reliant on the power network and the road network. And this hierarchical Bayesian model allows us to make connections within networks, but then across networks as well. Okay, and the final task that we really had in the project was to develop a series of utilization case studies. And we decided on 3 here. So we looked at a case study of a flood in Brisbane, a tropical cyclone that going through southeast Queensland, and a bushfire on the Sunshine Coast. And the objective of the utilization case studies is really just to showcase how the model works, the type of outputs that you can get from it, and really to provide some information that hopefully is useful for end users. So the way that I'm going to really talk through the way we approached some of this work is really just by stepping through the way the final model works. And we'll kind of step in and out of this, this process chart to look at what was able to be achieved. Right. So if we think here along down the left side of the slide here, we have essentially the steps that are involved within the overarching model that we've been able to develop. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define our networks, and we define each of these. So rather than thinking of them as assets, we essentially, essentially we make everything nodes on these networks. So we have our 3 networks that we said we were looking at. So the potable water network, the power distribution network, and the transport network. And as mentioned, through our interactions with the network operators, what we ended up doing was identifying the 3 main components of each of these networks that might be very important for the network's functionality during an event, or the assets, really essentially the assets or the nodes that are most highly impacted. So the water network was broken down into the reservoirs, the pump stations, and the distribution pipes. The power network broken down into zone substations, distribution substations, and poles. And we treat the poles in a little bit of a different way. So we do our analysis at the level of the pole, But when we put it into the network, we actually aggregate several poles together by the feeders that they're on. And then the transport network was broken down into just different levels of roads, so highways, urban roads, and rural roads. And here's just an example of, if we look at Brisbane, on the left, we've got an example of what the node network looks like for the power distribution system through Brisbane. And we can see we've got the 3 different coloured nodes there, and how they're distributed. So as we sort of step down in the hierarchy of the assets, so zone substations, which feed power to distribution substations, which have feeders that essentially run between them, we can see that we've got many fewer zone substations than distribution substations, and then we have even more feeders. On the right, we have a similar sort of thing, but where we have our water network. Right. So once we've defined our networks, we then have to define the relationships between them. And this can be based on functional logic. So similar to what I just mentioned with the power, where we've got the zone station that feeds power to the distribution substation and has feeders that run between them, or it can be based on proximity. And the proximity is more around if we have, say, for example, a power pole that is next to a road. If the power pole falls over, it will impact on the road. So that's a more proximity relationship that gets brought into our analysis, right? And so here, when we look at the inter-network connections, so here we've got, say, an example of the connections we have between the poles. So, between the power and the water network. So we have feeders that connect pump stations to the power network, okay? And we have the poles proximity to each of the roads in the example in this case. Okay? So these are just ways that we do connect between the networks, as well as the individual hierarchy, which we have within each of the individual networks themselves. So once we have the network built, we then have to say, well, what is the hazard that is affecting it? And we step essentially outside the model here, and we do this within a standard GIS framework, which allows us, once we know the location of all our assets, or all our nodes, sorry, we can assign for a given flood or a given storm event, what is the inundation level at that node? What is the wind speed at that node for that event? And so at that point, we have a network and we have the level of hazard that is being experienced at each of the individual nodes. Then we can look to our vulnerability functions to identify what is the direct damage that is occurring in those particular locations. Okay. So to do this, we have our damage models or our vulnerability functions that we've developed. And we've got 2 types really. So we have vulnerability functions which relate the hazard metric, so that could be the inundation depth, to a ratio of damage. And this is really, which actually I'll show you in the next slide. And we also have threshold-based rules. So depending on the type of hazard and the type of damage information we are expecting out of it, we take these 2 approaches. So here I'll show you a couple of examples of the resulting damage functions that we have. So this first example is one for the power network when exposed to flood. And we can see on the left-hand side, because the impact of flood is quite different when we have a slow rising flood. So this could be just a riverine, a regular type of riverine flood. So think the Brisbane floods in 2022 or 2011. These are relatively slow rising events with relatively low velocity where assets are being impacted. So these are low velocity flows, so that example on the left. But you could have also high velocity flow events like a flash flood or a storm surge event where you might need to use the functions over on the right. And for the majority of our flood vulnerability functions, these were adopted by work that was carried out in New Zealand on very similar assets that they have over there. So we felt in this particular case that it was reasonable to port across a lot of the work that they'd done there to apply to the assets we have here in Australia. For wind damage, we have vulnerability functions that look similar to what we have up on the top right. So this is an example again for the power network for what was developed. And here we did actually have some damage information available through essentially feeder outage information that was provided to the Australian Energy Regulator, allowed us to essentially pin some parts of these functions. But there is also quite a bit of work that's been done around the world looking at power asset vulnerability to winds, and we were able to adopt similar shape functions to what they had, but being essentially bounded by the empirical data that we had here in Australia. So here we're relating gust wind speed at a location to the expected damage ratio. And here, sorry, I didn't mention this before, but the damage ratio here is essentially the percentage of damage that we expect to be occurring at a given asset. So if we have 50% or a 0.5 damage ratio, this is basically saying that we expect that the asset itself is 50% broken, or half of it is broken. This varies a little bit across the different networks. So for example, when we looked at the road networks, it was then, rather than thinking of how much of the road is damaged, it was essentially how much of the road is blocked. And the example being, again, for wind, 50% damage ratio for roads is that 50% of the road itself would be blocked due to debris that would need to be cleaned up. So each of the different functions represents something slightly different for the different networks. And the final one is where we use threshold-based rules. And this was used quite a bit in the bushfire scenario. And this was largely around the fact that, unlike flood and wind, where we were able to have this sort of continuous damage intensity of either inundation depth or wind speed, for bushfire, the general information that we thought would be available would really be around whether an area was in a region that was burnt or largely outside of a region that was burnt. So really we broke this down into burnt regions, buffer zones that sit around it, and then also the regions that sit outside that. So once we had this information, we were then able to assign the damage at individual nodes. We can then determine for each of those nodes how long it's going to take for those nodes to recover back to a level of functionality that allowed them to be incorporated back into the network itself. And this is a little bit different than repair. So we're not trying to estimate the time taken for an asset to be 100% repaired to where it was before. It's the time taken for that asset to be brought back online to a level that allows it to function. And sometimes these things are the same, but sometimes they're different. And essentially, we have to look at the level of functionality at time equals 0. So this is basically, as soon as the event has passed, is an asset functional? And then if not, how long will it take for it to become functional? And we look out to 28 days. And again, these are just some examples of the recovery time approaches we took. So looking at that initial functionality, we were able to do this through logic-based rules. And so the top big left example is for inundation. So if a road has water inundation above 0 meters, then we considered it interrupted. And if it was less than 0 meters, it was not interrupted. And similarly, when we have wind damage, we would say, was the wind speed above or below a threshold that we expect would create enough debris to interrupt the road. And this is how we dealt with it at the initial point. But then when we looked at how long it would then take, we had essentially these recovery time functions that related the damage ratio, so the extent of damage that was calculated at each of the assets. This was used to determine how long it would then take for that asset to come back online. And there was essentially no information or no existing models that allowed us to do this. So this was really a consultative process with some of our industry partners. And I think there's probably still quite a lot of uncertainty that's associated with these, but we think they're a reasonably good start for developing these types of functions going forward. So once we then have for each of our nodes, we have an initial state of damage, an initial functionality, and an expected time for that node to come back online. We then needed to say that at a given point in time, given we know which nodes have been damaged and are not functional, what does that mean for the rest of the network? So we then had to apply this hierarchical Bayesian model to look at, given the connections that we have within a network and across a network, how does the functionality spread, sort of flow from one network to another or within a network itself? And once we have that, we can then look at a range of different ways at how we assess the impacts on the network itself. Okay. So what I'll now do is I'll just quickly go through two of our case studies to show what the outputs of the models are and give you an idea of the types of information we're at. So so as I mentioned earlier, we developed 3 case studies as part of the project. The first one was flooding in Brisbane, and what we decided to do here, and again, I'll say that the case studies were determined in consultation with the project management committee and also the infrastructure operators we were talking to. The first case study is flooding in Brisbane. And what we did here was we took Brisbane City Council's flood maps, where they provide 4 different inundation levels with different expected average recurrence intervals, and we looked at how the impacts would change across all of those 4. The second one was leveraging work that was done by Queensland Government and Geoscience Australia a couple of years ago, the Severe Wind Hazard Assessment for South East Queensland, where they came up with a series of hypothetical tropical cyclone events impacting the region. And one of these actually looks very, very similar to the forecast track for Cyclone Alfred a couple of years ago, except quite a lot more intense. So we thought this would be a very good case study to have a look at. So this is our Southeast Queensland tropical cyclone case study. And the third one was a bit of an amalgam of events up in the Sunshine Coast. So 2019, there was a reasonably large fire in Peregian Beach. So we took this and a couple of the fires from the nearby bushland over the year or two before that, and we just kind of stuck them all together and made a much larger event. So this one is more a hypothetical event that has a bit of a larger impact than some of the historical events in that region. So I'll just briefly talk today about the flood and the cyclone case studies. So if we look at the Brisbane City Council flood map, and the dashed line here represents the study region that we were looking at. And we're going to look at the 5%, 1%, 0.2 and 0.05% AEPs, or in other parlance, 20-year, 100-year, 500-year, and 2,000-year return period flooding events. So if we look firstly at the direct impacts, so here what we were doing was taking essentially the output from the vulnerability models and looking at how much of the network is damaged from those events. And on the figures on the left, what we're looking at is top left is your 20-year, top right is your 100-year, bottom left is your 500-year, bottom right is your 2,000-year. And what we're showing is the percentage of all nodes on the network that are lying within what we've called the minor, moderate, and major damage states. which is basically where we've got for minor damage ratio less than 20%, moderate is 20 to 50%, and major is 50%. And we can see that in the 1 in 20 year event, or the AEP of 5% in the top left, we're really only impacting less than 1% of the nodes on the network. And for essentially the level of damage that is experienced by those nodes that are impacted is only of the minor variety. So there is impact from a 20-year event on individual nodes, but they're not particularly major types of impacts. But then when we start stepping it up into the 1 in 100 year, and I'll just note that for the sort of next three, the scale on the figure changes. We can see we're now getting up to near in that 5 to 10% region of all nodes on these networks are now being impacted. And we're starting, particularly in the power, to see that we're shifting from minor damage to more moderate damage at some of these nodes. And what we'll see in a minute is once we do that, we really start looking at cascading that damage to many, many more assets. And as we then step through, we get increasingly large direct impacts on the network. And as we go through, more and more of that damage becomes major, particularly to the power network. So if we look geographically at some of these impacts, so here we're looking at, in this figure, we have all of the nodes on the power network. Grey is an unimpacted node, and the red is where we have impact. So this is a 20-year event where we had, you can see sort of a light smattering of red around the city, mostly sort of, as you would expect, sitting around low-lying regions or by the river. But if we then look at how the damage cascade works and progresses damage, we can see that this spreads very, very quickly. So even where we've got low levels of direct damage, we actually can have really quite substantial impacts to the functionality of the network because critical assets on those networks are being impacted. And in this particular case, what ends up happening is we have essentially either zone substations or distribution substations that get damaged, and then any of the feeders that are then connected to them also then get damaged. And this highlights one sort of simplification we've made within the model, in that we essentially have said that there is basically 100% probability that a feeder connected to a distribution substation that is damaged will also, well, that is functionally impacted, will also be functionally impacted. In reality, this is probably not 100% true because you have redundancy in systems that allow the network to bypass different substations. But the way we've set up the hierarchical Bayesian model is that could be incorporated through some probability factors, which we haven't done, but going forward is actually a way that we think this could be improved and become a little bit more realistic. And the last type of output that we have here is the recovery time models, and the way the figures are in the same order, but what we're looking at here is essentially time along the x-axis and the percentage of nodes on the network that are interrupted. Okay. We've got two types of things being plotted. The solid circles are the percentage of interrupted nodes due to direct damage. The open circles are the percentage of interrupted nodes due after we do the cascade analysis. And what we can see is that for the majority in the lowest flooding scenario, as we saw before, we've only got about 1 to 2% of nodes being impacted. And these recover really within a day or so, except on the power network. So we can't actually see it on this scale, but this goes up a little bit higher, where we have that large cascade of damage that we saw really being due to some of the critical nodes on the network being impacted in this scenario. And that takes then much longer to recover, or much more of the network is impacted, which takes longer to recover. But here we're saying for this event, within a couple of days, we would expect that we're largely back to 100% functionality, or essentially 0% interrupted nodes. As we progress through, again, the scale is changing across these on the y-axis. But as the initial interruption is increasing, the time taken to get back to fully functional is also increasing. And in the scenarios here, what's really important is we can see that the power network is the one that is taking the longest to recover. And a lot of this is around the fact that in these scenarios, we get some of our zone substations being impacted, which, as I mentioned, in this current modelling approach, because we don't have redundancy that allows the model to work around that, that is then reliant on that zone substation coming back for the entire region then to come back online. So then to the second case study, the tropical cyclone, which we'll just quickly go through. So here, this is essentially the winds that were experienced in the cyclone. Computationally, we break this down into different regions. So we're just going to talk about the Brisbane region here. But again, if we look geographically, as you might expect, again, sorry, this is just the power network. We've got the grey points being all our nodes, and the red points being those that have been directly damaged. We can see that if we then run our cascade analysis on it, it again spreads out. This again is due to the linkage that we have within the network, that if something higher on the hierarchy is damaged, then it spreads down to all the other assets below it, right? If we were to look at the same direct impacts, we can see this is actually a very, very impactful event, which you might expect for a Category 4 cyclone coming into southeast Queensland. And we can see that sort of nearly 80% of the assets on the network are impacted in some way. So not all of these are impacted to the level where it would impede functionality, but they're experiencing some level of damage. And as we can see here, that the vast majority are minor impacts, but there are some moderate damage. There is some moderate damage to some of the assets as well. And I'll just point out that the fact that water is showing no impact here is actually just a consequence of the fact that the assets that we had on the water network, we make the assumption that within the modelling framework that it doesn't get direct damage from wind, which may or may not be appropriate, but that's just what currently exists in the model. If we then look at the functionality, we can again see that the solid lines being the direct damage have recovery over sort of 2 to 3 days, with the functionality of the full network being much higher because of the cascade damage running through, which then takes a little bit longer for that to recover over the network itself. What did we find, and what do we take away from this? And so really some of the key points we found with the project were that access to damage data and impact data was really quite limited. And this really did impede our ability to develop some of the recovery and damage models that we wanted. So we think probably the best way forward for this is really through some systematic expert elicitation process. This has been done in other places, and I think is probably going to be quite useful here. The cascading is really, really important. And I think what these models have shown is that if we don't include it, then we're really going to be underestimating the impact that these types of events can have. Networks, complicated, and they do need to be simplified within any modeling, but we do need to be very careful not to oversimplify them. And really the thing I brought up a couple of times around redundancy in the network, which we did simplify out of our current model, I think is something that we probably can't simplify out of these models. So keeping that, being careful about getting the simplifications to a level that is suitable, I think is really important. And what we did show that I think the model is a very effective tool for looking at how networks are going to respond, identifying vulnerabilities, and being able to tell stories about impact from these events. And I think at that point, I will probably leave it for my presentation, and I might turn over to Matt Dyer from QFD to give us a bit of some thoughts on how end users may use models.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. You know what they say, too many Matts are barely enough, as my slide pops up on the screen. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I am going to chat about what I think this project matters to the Fire Department, Queensland Fire Department, and the emergency and disaster management sector, and the project's relevance to my department's operational capability, risk and resilience. So at a high level, this project reinforces something we already know in disaster management. Disasters do not happen in isolation. A flood, a cyclone, a bushfire, or earthquake, or any number of hazards rarely affects just one asset or one location. It triggers cascading effects through roads, power, water, and other infrastructure systems and communities that rely on that infrastructure every day. The real value of this project is that it helps us see those dependencies more clearly. It gives us a practical way to think about how impacts can spread across connected systems. And for QFD, that matters because our job is not only to respond when something goes wrong, but to prevent, prepare for, mitigate, and recover from disasters in a way that protects lives and property. The project's modelling framework helps us move beyond our, sometimes can be a narrow view, I suppose, of direct damage and towards a systems view, where we can better understand how an event at one point in the network can affect wider operational performance. That's highly relevant to fire events, but also to floods and cyclones and other hazards, because each of those hazards can interrupt the infrastructure that underpins our response capability. From a QFD perspective, the research is useful because it can improve our operational decision-making in three ways. First, it helps us identify critical dependencies, especially where one network depends on another, such as power supporting water pumping stations or road access affecting response, access and recovery. Second, it helps us prioritize which systems or system elements are most important to protect, support or recover first. And that recovery piece is so important. And third, it gives us a better basis for planning exercises, scenario development, and partnership discussions with infrastructure owners. Now, this is especially important for key operational capabilities that my department has, which includes bushfire mitigation, bushfire operations and response, and technical rescue. Now, in bushfire mitigation, understanding where critical infrastructure dependencies sit helps us target risk reduction conversations and identify where failure of an asset could have wider consequences for communities and response efforts. So that's bushfire mitigation. If we think about more operationally in bushfire operations and response, it helps us anticipate where access, comms, water supply, and power may be compromised, which directly affects deployment, planning, logistics, and our operational tempo. That's a non-trivial component. And in technical rescue, it helps us think more carefully about hazards affecting roads, utilities, those structural interfaces, and access to trapped or isolated people, especially when one failure can rapidly create another. Of course, in Queensland, through our Queensland disaster management arrangements, we are always thinking about all hazards. We must always be aware about thinking and planning for any type of hazard, not just one specific event type. The emphasis there is on a common management framework that can be applied across different emergencies and disasters. Our work here with Matt and the team really helps us apply that all hazards approach. We've talked about case studies in this project, but they apply across multiple hazards. This project also sits very naturally alongside the Queensland Critical Infrastructure Disaster Risk Assessment, which my team built a couple of years ago. We call that the CINDRA. The CINDRA gives Queensland a state-level view of general trends and risks for critical infrastructure, but it doesn't focus on at an asset level. That would be too much detail. So that makes it a valuable strategic tool, especially for district and local disaster groups trying to understand broad patterns of risk and how they manifest in their own areas. And my office is my colleagues that sit on those groups across Queensland, 77 across Queensland, plus another layer above that, of which there's around 23, touching every single community in Queensland. So what this research adds then is a stronger method for thinking about how those broad risks actually cascade through those interconnected systems. In other words, our CINDRA, our Critical Infrastructure Disaster Risk Assessment, helps frame that risk landscape, and this project helps explain how the consequences of that risk might propagate through real-world networks. A future iteration of the Syndra could actually be strengthened by incorporating methods from this project, such as the network-based dependency mapping or scenario testing and the Bayesian network model there. That would not mean turning the Syndra into, again, that asset-by-asset tool, too much detail, but it would help improve its ability to show where general trends are likely to produce larger system effects and where dependency hotspots are most likely to matter for our department operationally and for those disaster management groups across Queensland. The project's case studies are especially useful because they demonstrate multiple hazard types rather than only one. I've talked about our all hazards approach. So for floods, the modelling shows that the direct damage is only part of the story. Power interruptions can cascade into water impacts, and the consequences can be broader than the original damage footprint. For cyclones, the study shows that wind impacts on one part of the network can disrupt services well beyond the first damaged asset. And for bushfire, the project highlights that even where direct consequences, where direct asset damage might be limited in some parts of the network, the functional consequences can still be significant because access, power, and interconnected service pathways are still disrupted. Let me say a few words really quickly too about earthquake. It wasn't a case study here, and I do so because Australia generally isn't considered overly seismically active, but we are certainly not immune. And it will be officers from departments like mine that will be the first running into that maelstrom and devastation when everyone else hopefully is running away. So that's why earthquake, we think about that in our department oftentimes. Earthquake is, it's a classic example of a hazard that can create multiple simultaneously failures across infrastructure networks. And the modelling approach in this project offers a really useful way to think about how those failures would propagate, not just in the case studies we use here, but in other ones that could be quite salient. So earthquake being this example here. And I might too just make a note about the Bayesian networks approach that Matt talked about. One of the strengths of this project is that it introduces a more advanced analytical method to the emergency management conversation in a way that is practical rather than just abstract. So the Bayesian networks are useful because they help model dependencies and update our understanding of risk as more information becomes available. That idea will sound familiar to so many disaster managers because in practice, we do a very similar thing. Experienced operational officers use their lived experience, their local knowledge, their lessons learned, and changing situational awareness to update their expectations about what's likely to happen next. And in that sense, we're already using a heuristic or human version of Bayesian reasoning every day, if you'll allow. The research here doesn't replace that judgment; it builds on it. It helps formalize it in our practice. So I love that it helps professionalize and enhance the way we think about this sort of information. I love Bayesian statistics. You know, they're all about priors and posteriors. And honestly, working with Bayesian network models like this one helps us update our priors and quite literally protect our posteriors. Ha! That's a Bayesian statistics joke. You came for the science, you stayed for the jokes. I'm sorry. So how can QFD actually use these findings? I think there are 5 practical applications. I'll talk about 5 really quickly. First, we can use the case studies in pre-season planning and scenario exercises, especially for Southeast Queensland and other regions with known infrastructure interdependencies. Second, we can use the findings to inform discussions with asset owners about critical dependencies and recovery priorities. Third, we can use the logic of the model to sharpen our understanding of which assets may have consequences far beyond their physical location, and some of which might surprise us. We hate surprises in emergencies, but they happen all the time. This helps us control for some of those surprises. Fourth, we can use this sort of research to support our exercise design, especially for multi-agency simulations of cascading failure. We can actually zoom in and do that sort of exercise. And fifth, we can use this project to improve recovery planning by understanding that restoration of functionality may depend on upstream infrastructure being restored first. A lot of that we know from our lived experience, but this puts a rigor behind arguments for doing exactly that, for prioritizing effort. So that's really relevant for us if I think about our operational capabilities. So in bushfire operations and response, where access, comms, and water supply and power often become limiting factors, It also matters for that bushfire mitigation, because the more we understand dependency chains, the better we can target mitigation discussions and identify where investment or protective measures may have the greatest benefit. And it matters for our technical rescue capability, because disrupted roads, fallen infrastructure, compromised utilities, and inaccessible sites all shape the complexity and safety of rescue operations. And that safety piece for our officers going into dangerous environments is absolutely critical for our department. In closing, I see this project as highly valuable for our department and for the sector, because it helps us understand cascading consequences, improves how we think about infrastructure dependence, and gives us a practical framework for better planning and partnership. It aligns well with my department's capability framework. It supports our operational priorities, bushfire mitigation, bush operations response, and technical rescue. It's just 3 discrete capabilities that are, I guess pretty. They get a lot of press, a lot of media. That's where most of our pictures come from, those 3 operational capabilities. The project also complements our strategic purpose provided through our critical infrastructure disaster risk assessment, the CINDRA. Most importantly, it helps us combine the strength of practitioner experience with the discipline of modern analysis, so that our planning for the next flood, cyclone, bushfire, or earthquake, or whatever, is more rigorous, more connected, and ultimately more effective. Thank you, Matt, for leading the work, the research on this, and thank you, NHRA, for your support of the project over the time that it's run. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Amazing presentation and such a great engagement, really. And I must say that strong engagement has in fact been one of the standouts aspect of this project. Strong engagement from across the energy, water, transport, and emergency management sectors. So their contributions have not only reached, I guess, the research, but also highlighted this such a clear need for more advanced tool to better understand infrastructure, vulnerabilities, critical dependencies, and informed planning and recovery decision making. So today's webinar has been that opportunity, right, to reflect on those outcomes, to capture the key lessons, and obviously inspire utilization opportunities. So I would like to thank you, our speakers, Associate Professor Matt Mason and Matt Dyer, for taking the time to share their work today. And for updates of everything Natural Hazards Research Australia, sign up to our newsletter and follow us on social media. Thank you and see you next time.